Greetings from Oklahoma. My name is Glenn Selk. I realize that the environment in which I have worked during my extension career is different than what you have in Florida. And so what I wanted to do was to try to look back at some of the really special operations that I had the opportunity to visit with and work with here in Oklahoma through my career, and see if there were some commonalities, some things that they did that seemed to make them successful and that they were still around through the many years of my career. I started basically in 1973 and retired from full-time extension in 2010. And so looking back over that long period of time as to which of these ranchers were still involved with the same kind of a program, and in some cases they had passed it along to the next generation. I wanted to try to discern what I could that were the key concepts that they did that seemed to be a little bit different from some of the other commercial producers that I'd worked with and had observed through the years. Some of the things that I thought was the reasons why they were still going and some of the others had sold out, had gone by the wayside. And so what I tried to do was put together 4 of the key items that I thought that they were using that could be transferable from not only all across Oklahoma, but even to other parts of the country, such as Northwest Florida. Now, I want to point out that this is not an all-inclusive list. The 4 items that I've picked may not be the most important to you. It may not be the most important to someone else here in Oklahoma. Certainly, they don't include such things as cow herd health, because I think, quite frankly, that is something that you probably need to work with a veterinarian on in your region to understand what disease components you need to work with, what parasite control you need to be concerned about. I didn't include genetics because, quite frankly, even of the 4 or 5 operations that I'm describing today, they looked at their genetic component in their herd differently. They all were very concentrated on having excellent genetics in their herd, but their pathways were headed different directions. Pasture management is something I don't think that I'm qualified to visit with you about in terms of Northwest Florida. And there's other items that you could put on the list that I haven't included, and one of those I know is individual identification and good record keeping. But there are others that you can think of as well that you probably could include, and certainly I wouldn't argue with. But the number one concept that I want to start with that was common to these 4 or 5 operations that I'm describing was they had a calving season, and it was a well-defined calving season. Whether it was 60 or 75 days of length is irrelevant to me. I would prefer 60 if I was going to put together a herd today, but certainly the important part was they had a defined calving season. And that means that you've got to put the bull or the bulls up into a separate pasture for about 10 months out of the year. And that becomes one of the number 1 reasons why some of our producers still have year-round calving programs, because they think they can't afford to put together a bull fence. They can't afford to feed that bull separately, and they are afraid to miss out on that opportunity to have that late calving cow, the one that doesn't come into heat for not only 60 or 75 days, she may not come back into heat for 100 or 120 days, and they're afraid to miss that next calf that she might have. Well, I think you can't afford to not have a defined calving season. Let's look at some data. This comes from the standardized performance analysis work that was done in 3 states here in the Southwest, about 400 herds. Standardized performance analysis, if you're not acquainted with that particular procedure that was done in the late 90s, early 2000s, is a way of analyzing costs in individual herds to where they can compare how their costs of production are as compared to other herds in their region or even around the country. And so in this particular situation, in this data set, one of the things that came out of the SPA data that was done back in 2004, reported on in 2005, for each 1 day increase in breeding season, on the average for these 400 herds, it was almost a nickel increase in the cost of production of 100 pounds of weaned calf. Now, nickel doesn't buy much anymore, but when you put 305 of those nickels together, and that's what you'd have when you compare year-round calving to a 60-day breeding and calving season, that then meant that those herds that had that confined, defined breeding and calving season, their cost of production was $14.33 less per hundredweight. And if you equate that out to a 500-pound calf, that's about $71 per calf less cost that those herds had, and in relationship with herds that had year-round calving. The reason that works is because it allows these herds to be more efficient in their production and management programs. They can be efficient in terms of feeding the cows. We know that dry pregnant cows require less in terms of protein and energy than a newly lactating cow. If we have a year-round calving program, we have wet cows with dry cows all mixed together. We're either overfeeding one group and underfeeding another, or both, and very much a loss in terms of efficiency. Health programs can be more precise and more effective. There are some vaccinations that must be given only to open cows. Well, it's hard to do when you don't know which ones are open, which ones are bred. They're all mixed together, and it takes you away from having those kinds of health programs available to you, such things as even the scours vaccines. Those that are given to those pregnant cows 6 weeks or 2 months ahead of the start of the calving season, it's very difficult to do that when you don't know when those cows are calving, where they are in terms of their production year. And again, those health concepts are really not available to you. It allows you, if you have a defined calving season, and do the pregnancy testing shortly after that breeding season is over, that allows you to identify problems and to diagnose them more quickly. In other words, if you have an above average percentage of cows that are open a particular year, you can identify that quickly and start to diagnose what was the cause of that. Was it disease? Was it perhaps a failure from the male side, the bulls? But this gives you a chance to identify and diagnose and solve those problems more quickly. If you have a year-round program, very difficult to do. And then the next step in terms of from the production side, especially for small herds, if we've got a defined calving season, then we can put together a group of calves that can be marketed together. And why is that important? When you look at some of the data that comes from Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Quality Beef Network, OQBN is the acronym that we use. It's a value-added calf program that's been going on for a number of years. Looking back at data from 2010 up to 2013, all of these calves represented on the chart are calves that have gone through a value-added program. They've been vaccinated, they have been weaned for 45 days prior to marketing. So the only real difference is the size of the group of calves that were being put together. And you can see that as we go from about 5 head up to 20 head, that's where the curve is the steepest. And you can see the incremental increases of $2.58 as we went from 5 to 10 head, $1.22 as we went up the next 5 head, and 89 cents a hundredweight as we went from 15 to 20. But you put all of that together, which I think is very doable for our smaller herds. A 50-cow herd putting together 20 steer calves that were born together, look alike, and they've been treated and managed together, then that seems to have some real value to buyers. Turns out the difference on the average in those 3 to 4 years was $4.69 a hundredweight. That's another $23 to $24 per head on top of then the reduced costs that we talked about in those previous slides. Now, just because we've got a defined breeding season and defined calving season, we're looking at in the neighborhood of about $100 less that we can look at as being able to put that in our pockets as compared to in those other herds that is just lost possibilities in terms of income. Now let's move on to key concept number 2. And it ties right back to what we talked about in key concept number 1. But now I'm talking about when we're having this defined breeding and calving season. Calving, I think, needs to occur at a time of the year when we can be assured that cows are in good body condition. That's very, very important in terms of determining how long it's going to take them to come back to recycle, to rebreed for the next year's calf crop. The breeding season, in my mind, needs to be done at a time when the environment, the weather, doesn't interfere with successful breeding. And so let's look at those two things first of all. At calving time, the body condition that these cows are in the day they calve goes a long ways to determining how long it's going to be between calving and when she returns to heat cycles to have a chance to rebreed for next year's calf crop. And so if we look at that from the standpoint of the length of time from calving until returning to heat cycles, that tells us then that if it's happening more quickly, she's going to have more opportunities to be cycling during the breeding season and therefore increase the opportunities she has to get pregnant. And that's why we see the differences in body condition of cows and the outcome in terms of pregnancy percentage the next breeding season. Make sure that we're all on the same wavelength in terms of what I'm talking about body condition. It's basically the fatness. It's a visual evaluation of the nutritional status of these cows. I have a 1 through 9 system that we use. Quite frankly, 1 through 3 is way too thin. You'd all agree on that. 7, 8, and 9 are cows that are very, very fat and quite frankly expensive if we try to get them that fat with store-bought and feed. So most of the cows we're talking about are in those middle 3 scores of 4, 5, and 6. And I think these pictures of some red-hided cows give you an idea of what I'm looking at in terms of thinness and fleshiness of those 3 scores. Won't go into a lot of detail about body condition scoring, we don't have time, but I want you to have an idea of what I'm talking about so that when we look at the data summarized from 6 different trials, 4 different states, as to the impact of body condition at calving and the rebreeding percentages in the upcoming breeding season, and again it's going to be a defined breeding season, 60 to 75 days in these particular trials, you'll see that the cows that were 4 or less, those thinner ones, rebred pretty poorly at 60%. Cows that were in that 5 group rebred at about 80, 81%, and the 6s, well, they rebred very nicely, 92% on the average. The black bars on that particular slide illustrate the variation in those 6 trials. And so you see wide variation in the 4s and even the 5s. And so it does depend a little bit on what's going on after calving until the start of the breeding season with those thinner cows. The cows in better body condition, they seem to handle a little bit of weight loss and still recycle and do pretty well as they go into and through the breeding season. So I think that this is a key slide to remember as we're thinking about when that calving season is. Can we get them into that 5 and 6 category utilizing the natural resources, the forage resources that we have on our place in order to achieve and get them into that body condition at calving time as inexpensively as possible. Now the breeding season obviously is going to determine when the calving season is. I think it's critical that we understand that in the southern part of the United States, we have to work around heat. Here in Oklahoma, we have a lot of number of days in the summertime where the heat is well above 90 degrees, often approaching 100 degrees. We need to understand that cattle don't thermal regulate very well in those hot temperatures, as well as we humans do. And research has shown us that if we have a 1.5 degree increase in core body temperature for an extended period of time, it can adversely affect reproductive rates. Let's look at some information that's gathered. This is some old literature review done by a gentleman named Christensen back in the 70s, reported it in the 80s, and it shocked me when I first saw this. And he said that high temperatures and humidity had the most effect on reproduction in beef cows, that pregnancy rates and calving rates of only 10 to 25% were common in the research that he had observed in July through September. And I thought, man, that's awful low. But when you start adding it up as terms of high temperatures reducing conception rate, postpartum interval, that's the length of time from the calving until she returns to heat again, and the amount of time that she's in standing estrus. If you're trying to do AI in hot weather, you will have a more difficult time determining which of these cows actually started in the standing heat and when to breed them. Cows will fluctuate in body temperature throughout the day in summertime. This is some data that comes from the University of Nebraska, and you can see that in a nice day when the high is 70 and the lows are in the 50s and 60s, cow body temperature doesn't fluctuate much. When you start going up to just 80 degrees, in that situation, the nighttime lows 60 degrees, we start to see fluctuations in core body temperature of a degree or a little bit more. And when you get into those hot summer days of 90 for highs, now you start to see fluctuations of core body temperature of 1.5 degrees, approaching 2 degrees. Note, if you can, as you look at the last curve on that slide, that the highest body temperatures don't occur in late afternoon. They continue to climb until the evening hours. And I think that's important for those folks that are doing artificial insemination. You want to time your breeding to happen in the morning hours in our part of the world, whether it be Florida or Oklahoma. Nighttime lows often won't be as low as what they're showing here in this Nebraska study, and we need to have these cows in the coolest part of the day when we actually inseminate. Data from your operation at the University of Florida with dairy cattle indicated that if we had a core body temperature increase of only 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit, we had a loss in conception rates of about 13%. Well, we can have those kinds of fluctuations in body temperature to that and even more. Work here at Oklahoma State indicated that not only the core body temperature being elevated at the time of breeding, but the next week after breeding could have quite an effect. This is data that looked at cows that were bred and 7 days later put into environmental chambers to either be kept at about 71 degrees around the clock or put under moderate stress, 97 degrees at night, or daytime, 91 degrees at night, with relatively low humidity at 27%. They called that moderate stress. It'd be pretty hot for me. It elevated the core body temperature on the average 0.7 degrees. The severe stress group had about the same temperature during the daytime and nighttime, but they increased the humidity, much like you might have in Florida, and now that core body temperature was increased by over 1.5 degrees. What happened was that they started to lose, and this is just at day 14 after breeding, they had lost some of the pregnancies. You see the pregnancies that were still present as they took those cows to the slaughter plant and looked at the reproductive tracts to see what was present. 83%, pretty high pregnancy rate for one breeding with those control cows, drops to 64 for those in moderate stress and down to 50% for those that were highly stressed. Now look at the weights of the conceptus. That's just that little embryo that's growing in there and the fluids around it. And you'll see that those severely stressed embryos that are still alive at this point in time only weigh half as much as those in the control cows. I'm suspecting that some of those will actually disappear and go away. So we get an idea of what heat can do in terms of from the female side. We know it's just as devastating from the bull side. This is a study done here in Oklahoma where they put bulls into heat chambers, very similar to the ones that we talked about for the cows. Over an 8-week period of time, these bulls were subjected to pretty high temperatures during both the daytime and nighttime hours. And over a 2-month period of time, semen quality just continues to fall off. An important part of this chart is that immediately removing the heat stress does not immediately solve the problem. It took these bulls another 8 weeks or 2 months to return completely to normal. So we have both the female side and the male side being affected if we try to breed during those months of July, August, September. And so I think we want to do what we can. As we summarize here, key concepts 1 and 2, we want to have well-defined breeding and calving seasons, have them calve when they're in good body condition, and plan the breeding season in moderate temperatures that will allow optimum pregnancy rates as we put this whole package together. As we move on to the third key concept, and this one's going to be about growing and developing, selecting replacement heifers, I think you'll notice that all three of these concepts are very much intertwined with each other. They certainly all involve some of the very same important principles, whether we talk about adult cows or these replacement heifers that we're keeping back to be future cows in the cow herd. There's two different selection and growing programs that I see being used in herds here in Oklahoma. Number one, I kind of call the natural selection program, where we develop the heifers slowly, perhaps inexpensively from the time that they're weaned until they go into that first breeding season, with a target weight of only 50 to 55% of their mature weight at the start of the breeding season. The second program is one where the heifers are developed at a more rapid rate, at 1.5 to 2 pounds per head per day, and now we're shooting for a target weight of 60 to 65% of their mature weight at breeding. Let's take a look at those two programs. With the first one, we need to realize that only about half of these heifers will be cycling at the start of the breeding season. And if we can keep a short breeding season, then we let Mother Nature do the selection as to which of these heifers actually become pregnant, and they become our replacements. In this situation, then, you're going to have to plan to keep at least 50% more heifers as replacements going into that first growing and breeding season program, so that you have enough bred that meets your needs for potential replacements. I'll point out again that you're putting the selection pressure on reproduction rather than on other traits that might be of interest to you. You'll do that by having a short 30 to 45 day breeding season and then having them preg checked. Once you determine which ones are pregnant, which ones are open, we want to go ahead and cull and sell those opens immediately so that they're still young enough to go into a feedlot and come out as choice beef. Makes a lot of difference in the price, as opposed to waiting until the following calving season to find out which ones of those heifers didn't get bred, and now you have an open 2-year-old that you're having to sell at a discounted price. The second strategy is one where we expect 90% of the heifers to be cycling at the start of the breeding season, and so probably only need to keep about 10% more than what we actually are going to need to go into as bred heifers into our cow herd. With this kind of a program, then we can put selection pressure on other traits. A classic one, a herd that I know of, really was concerned about carcass traits of the cattle that they sent onto not only market but into the feedlot and to the packing plant. And so they were interested in selecting heifers out of cows that had a previous history of producing calves that would be high grading calves. Again, those few heifers that didn't get bred after this program, we need to market them immediately for the same reasons we talked about in strategy number 1. So, when we're thinking about growing these heifers from breeding until calving, whichever program we use, to get them to the breeding season, whichever program that is, then as we go after the breeding season into the calving season, having them grown out properly, I think, is critical. We want to remember what's going on with that 2-year-old at calving time. She's still growing. She's changing from baby teeth to adult teeth. We're asking her to lactate, to give milk, and to produce enough colostrum in that first milk to give that calf some disease protection, repair a reproductive tract, return to estrus cycles, and rebreed in 85 days in order for her to have a calf at the same time next year. And quite frankly, that's a big chore. It requires that she have some energy available to do that. And I think one of the next questions that'll pop into your mind is, if we have this heifer in good body condition, does that increase calving difficulty? The answer is no, if we can stay in that body condition score 6 category that we've talked about before. Once we get fatter than that, 7s and 8s, it looks like then we might have the possibility of fat buildup in the birth canal causing potential problems. So I'll emphasize again that I think those 2-year-olds need to be in a pretty narrow window in terms of body condition, certainly 5.5 to 6. Let's see what happens if we don't do that. There's 2 data sets I want to show you, and this one is certainly has a lot of numbers on it, but stick with me. I think there's 2 important lessons that come out of this study from the University of Missouri back in the late 90s. On the left-hand side, you'll see that the body condition score of 2-year-olds at calving time, ranging from very thin, 3s, up to 5.5. And across the top, you'll see what happened to these heifers in terms of body condition after calving, in terms of whether they were still losing more condition, the minuses, the -1, -0.5, or on the right-hand side, those heifers that were actually gaining body condition after calving. And then the white numbers represent the number of days between calving and when they return to estrus cycles to have a chance to recycle and rebreed. First thing that I notice from this chart is there's not very many numbers on there that are 85 days and less. And that tells me that that's a good reason why many of our producers tend to want to breed those replacement heifers perhaps starting 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the adult cows, certainly early in the breeding season, to give them the extra days to have a chance to recycle and rebreed and stay on time with the cow herd so that they themselves don't cause this calving season to lengthen out. The other lesson is take a look at the 2 arrows. The heifer that was in decent body condition, 5.5, that lost a half a score between calving and 90 days later, she returned to estrus in 102 days. Now compare that to a heifer that calved thin of 4, but was fed enough, and that takes a lot of feed to feed a 2-year-old that's nursing a calf to gain a full 1.5 body condition scores. So she's actually fleshier at the 90-day checkpoint than the other heifer. But even though she was fed that much more after calving, it still took her 9 days longer to return to estrus to have a chance to rebreed. And I think that's an important point that we want to remember, that it's tough for them to catch up if they calve in thin body condition. Another study similar to it that was done here in Oklahoma, where Dr. Wedeman on our staff took a set of heifers, divided them in half, and fed half of these heifers to get to calving at a body condition score 5 or greater. The other half were fed to calve at a lesser body condition, thinner, at 4 or less. And then he divided each one of those 2 groups in half again. Half of each one of those 2 groups was fed to just maintain that body condition into and through the breeding season. The other half was fed to gain body condition after calving. And again, remember, it's not easy to do with a 2-year-old to put condition on her after she calves. Well, let's take a look at those, what took place with the heifers that were in good body condition, those that were in 5s or aboves. And in this case, they actually got some improvement in body condition on those that they fed to gain, those that they wanted to just maintain. They did a pretty good job with that, with those that were 5 and above, and those that were thin looked like this. Fed a lot of feed, expensive feed. It calculated out to be about $148 per head between calving and 12 weeks later in order to get that kind of improvement in body condition on those heifers versus the ones that were thin and they just tried to maintain them into and through the breeding season. Now look at the rebreed percentages of these 4 groups of heifers as they show up on the screen. Those that were thin at calving and they just tried to maintain it rebred poorly. No great surprise there. That you know that going to take them a long time to recycle, to have a chance to rebreed, a low chance in that confined breeding season. Their counterparts that were fed a great deal of feed after calving, even though they were thin at calving, it improved the rebreeding percentage substantially. And so if you stop the chart right there, you might think, well, this might work. I can calve them thin and feed them a lot afterwards. Take a look at what happens if we just had those heifers in good body condition at calving time and maintained it. Much higher rebreeding percentage than either one of those other 2 groups. And quite frankly, the $148 worth of feed on those that were already in good body condition probably wasn't paid for by that extra 3% increase in pregnancy rates. But I think we can learn from both of those sets of data that these 2-year-olds need to be in good body condition, a 5.5 or a 6. And I think that's a pretty narrow window that we're shooting at calving time. And remember, if they're thin at calving, we can put all the good feed in the world, they probably won't catch up in terms of rebreeding percentage with what we would have seen with heifers that were in good body shape at calving time. Now, the key concept number 4 is one that perhaps only in a small way fits with the other 3. As you remember at the very, very beginning when we talked about a defined breeding season, the importance of being able to put together these larger lot sizes. If we could get to 20 head of calves that look alike, kind of like these on this particular slide, where they look like peas in a pod, they've been treated the same, genetically they're the same, and buyers can trust with what they're going to do. If we have those kinds of calves, I think the next step is to market those calves. And I say market with parentheses or italics and bold, whatever kind of font I can use to emphasize the concept of market rather than just take them to town and sell them. There's a big difference in my mind. The concept of marketing calves, beyond that of just providing them to a local livestock market and taking what we get, is to find a program where perhaps a value-added program that fits your particular situation, and there's a myriad of them that are available. We have one here in Oklahoma that we call the Oklahoma Quality Beef Network, but there's certainly many others. Find one that fits your program, your calves. In all of these cases, they're going to require that these calves be weaned at least 45 days by the time that they're being marketed. There will be different protocols as to what the vaccination requirements are. I'd follow them closely. And a good program has third-party verification to see that these procedures are done, that these calves are castrated, they're dehorned, and that that's all been healed up, and they've received the immunizations that are required. That way, buyers can buy them with confidence. And we know now, after several years of looking at data from the OQBN, or Oklahoma Quality Beef Network program, buyers are willing to pay for this reduced risk with these kinds of value-added programs. This is a summary of what's happened in this program over the past 9 years, of what the difference in the price per hundredweight being paid for both combined steers and heifers were for Oklahoma Quality Beef Network value-added calves compared to non-preconditioned calves sold on the same day at the same sale. And as you look across the 9 years here, you can see that it basically averages out about $12 per hundredweight as an advantage for those calves that have been through a value-added program, and that's pretty substantial. You perhaps have seen the recent popular press articles coming out of Kansas State where they've looked at the video programs, the video sale information from all across the country. In fact, just thousands and thousands of calves involved in that data set, and they basically come to the same conclusion. They were saying $50 a head advantage for those calves that have been through a VAC 45 program compared to calves that were non-weaned and non-vaccinated when they were actually put on the market. And so there's a real chance to make some improvements in the sale price of your calves by, I think, getting involved with one of these value-added programs and then doing what's required so that you're providing the kind of calf for the buyer that has the best chance to do him or her a good job. That is part of the marketing strategy. I think the other part is one where we here in Oklahoma have generally fallen down in the past. We have producers that certainly do a good job, have spent their lifetime putting together genetically the kind of herd and producing the kind of calves that they're interested in. They do the management procedures, making sure that the steers are weaned and castrated. If they need dehorning, dehorned, and all of that is done certainly with long enough time between working and when they go to the sale arena. They're vaccinated according to value-added protocols. In some cases, they're not directly even involved in one of the value-added programs, but they do all of these things anyway. Well, if you do, you've got good calves, they've been well managed, tell somebody so that you have a chance to have buyers that are interested in those kinds of calves looking at your calves and perhaps adding a little more price pressure on other buyers that are just going to get those calves hopefully at a discounted price. One of the strategies that has been shown to me from producers in the past that seems to have some effectiveness, and that is to make sure that they notify buyers whether they're in one of these programs or whether they're just going to market their calves on their own. Notify past buyers or potential new buyers that you can identify on the sale date of your calves. Whether it be in a video auction or a live market auction, why not get as many buyers there that are interested in your calves as possible? One producer told of just putting together a database of people that have bought his calves in the past, or even people that he thought of that would be interested in those kinds of cattle at that time of the year, and he wrote it out on a postcard. He put down when he was going to sell the calves, when the calves were weaned, basically what they'd been immunized for, and their expected sale weight. That way, he thought he had a better chance of getting more people interested in his calves on that particular date. This may seem a little bit out of the ordinary for a lot of cow-calf producers. We're a shy bunch. We don't like to be braggadocious. But if we've spent all of this effort through all these years to put together genetically the kinds of cattle that we're interested in, we think we'll do a good job, and we do all these management procedures, I think we need to brag about it and try to do the best job we can to promote that to potential buyers. If you have bought a bull from a purebred producer at a production sale in the last several years, chances are the next year he sent you a catalog for the upcoming production sale. Well, why can't we do the same thing with good commercial calves? I think there's some lessons to be learned from the other parts of the beef industry about marketing our calves and seeing if we can't get top dollar out of them each and every year. Well, that concludes the 4 concepts of cow herd sustainability. As I mentioned to you before, I get these ideas from producers that I have known that have been in the business for 30 years or more. In most cases, they've now passed it on to the next generation if there was one available to them. Remember, what I'm trying to get accomplished here is to look at the big picture, try to have a confined calving season that matches the environment so that they calve in good shape. They're in a breeding season that has the kind of weather and the lack of temperature stress to where the breeding season can occur with a high pregnancy rate, develop those replacement heifers to where they have a chance to stay in tune with the cow herd that they're moving into without causing an increase in the days of the calving season just because they're 2-year-olds and they're tough to get bred back. And then be proud of your calves, make an effort to market them, and I think in that way we can do a little better job of keeping this cow herd together for not only ourselves but the next generation.